The wheel of time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. Each week, we will be reading, discussing, and digesting a small selection from Robert Jordan's fantasy opus. This quest is led by Tylor, a true Wheel of Time warrior.
I have all stories, ages that were and that will be. And I'll be joined by Greg, a complete novice to the Wheel of Time.
The Wheel of Time and the wheel of a man's life turn alike without pity or mercy.
Join us each week as we read the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time, traveling deeper and deeper through the glass columns.
But what does that even mean?
No. You don't get to find out yet.
Hello. What are we doing? How are we here? It's a Friday. It's not Wednesday. What are we doing here? Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Greg, of course, and I am joined by Tylor, who will speak only when spoken to. And we are here to begin our special insert series in Through the Glass Columns, your weekly read-along, but not today, it's a watch-along podcast. I will stop with my shtick and eventually allow Tylor to talk by saying, if you're listening to this, what you should know is we are interrupting our feed this August by helping all of you, our faithful listeners, and perhaps some new ones, prepare for season 2 of Amazon's Wheel of Time television show. So we are going to be coming to you today and for the next 3 weeks after this to each to pick apart, discuss, and, do our usual making fun of each other in the context of 2 episodes of the television show each week. So, TLDR, that was rambly. Here it is briefly. Instead of reading 2 chapters every week, on Fridays, you can watch 2 episodes of television and come in and join us for the discussion. Tylor, you are now being spoken to. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing extremely well. I was playing a fun game of doing weird facial expressions while Greg was doing that introduction. So that was good for me, even if it was, I'm not going to say rambly. I'm going to say about as long as a Robert Jordan book. The nice thing about the television show, in my mind, is that it takes a lot of the themes and ideas in Wheel of Time and really compresses them down in interesting ways. And so it's really interesting to think about, how do we take a podcast that looked at a book that took us about a half a year and turn that into 4 weeks of podcasting plot-wise. So this has been something that's been on my mind a little bit as we're thinking about what are the rules of this new version of the podcast. But let me just begin with what is possibly right now my least favorite Wheel of Time opinion. I love the Wheel of Time television show. I think it is outstanding. I would maybe consider season 1 of this show better than book 1 of the Wheel of Time. Don't expect the series overall to be better than the book series, but it's some good TV. Greg, what were your thoughts just as an introduction to the series? You have now seen a grand total of 2 episodes of Wheel of Time television. What did you think of it?
I'm not going to tell you that yet, because I get to be withholding sometimes too. Before we go any further, before we start recording, you established some very clear rules, and I want to get those out in the open right now so people can decide whether they should or should not continue listening to this podcast. So Tylor and I have thought very carefully about these rules. Let me see if I can sum them up, and then he will correct me because, you've listened to us before, probably. That's our dynamic. So we are 2 people who are book nerds, and so we want to preserve the process of reading the book and enjoying the book while also making this set of podcasts accessible to anybody who might be looking to join in and get in on the fun of this. As we've alluded to before, we both have friends who are like, love you guys, definitely not reading that many books for you. So we know that we're perhaps getting some friends and family who are interested in checking out our show, and we hope our community grows a little bit. So this insert series of podcasts, these special episodes, are going to be 4 weeks where each week talks about 2 episodes of the first season of the book. We will limit our discussion to the events portrayed in those episodes and their, parallel representation in the book.
I was going to go corollary. That works.
All right, good. So we will try our best to not spoil either the end of the season of television or the end of the book or subsequent books. So if you're a fan of our read along show, we are smack dab, we're a healthy amount into book 3. But we're going to do our best not to allude specifically to any events in season 2 in book 2 or book 3 in order to make sure that we're not accidentally spoiling future television episodes. So again, Tyler, correct me if I'm wrong. The rule here is we are trying our best to make it so we don't spoil anything for anybody, whether they are book, show, or book and show.
Yes, that is correct. Which is a phrase I say remarkably often on the show, given that our dynamic is I correct you every time that you're wrong, which is a dynamic I can appreciate. So, given that you gave me a really solid correction there, we need to know the rules before we can play the game. Are you ready to tell
Let's
me what you think of the show?
Yeah, let's play the game now. All right. So you've all been warned. We are breaking into the first 2 episodes of The Wheel of Time. We are so ill prepared that I don't even know the titles of those 2 episodes, but it's episode 1 and episode 2.
Correct.
All right. I had a fantastic time watching this show. So, lifting the curtain, Tyler and I got together with one of our friends. We poured ourselves Negronis, I believe, and we enjoyed Negronis for the first episode and then big old bowls of ice cream for the second one. So we had a great time. And I have only seen the 2 episodes of the show. Tyler has seen the whole show. We're preserving
Many
this
times.
dynamic. I've only seen the first 2 episodes. So overall, I would be positive. I am positive. I would not say I am yet. This is astoundingly good television. I've seen a lot of the genre shows of the last few years. Some are better than others. And, I think this is in the mix with the better ones. I certainly found this much more compelling than House of Dragon. Sorry, House of
I
Dragon
dropped
fans.
out after 2 episodes.
That's about where I dropped out. Wherever the time jump was, I was like, nope, because the only thing I liked were the actresses in the first part. They were really good, and nope. I think it's certainly in the talk among those shows, and whether correct or not, those shows are grouped under the heading of genre shows. And Yet I'm not yet ready to say like I love this. Certainly am excited to keep seeing more. I certainly found many of the characters and performances compelling, but I would not say I'm yet like this is a masterpiece. I mean, I've seen Andor, so why would I say that about this show?
Yeah, I mean, I will say, I think that there is a real challenge when it comes to an adaptation as opposed to kind of a regular television show, right? Because you've both got kind of, is it good and what is the quality? And also, how well is it sticking to the original material? How well do you feel like it's earning the differences from the material? So I guess my question to some degree is, I know, for example, you have loved some of the new genre television that has come out in recent times, right? Obi-Wan, Andor, those are like, I assume, your kind of top tier, both for nostalgic and just straight up quality reasons. We both loved Andor. But I'm curious whether you think your opinion of Wheel of Time, how you suspect it has been influenced at all by the fact that you are in, the end of the first year of doing a podcast about the books. Because I know from what I've read online, I don't interact with a ton of Wheel of Time fans on a daily basis, but a lot of the people I've seen have had major complaints about kind of the adaptation, if not necessarily the overall quality. And if anything, I kind of lean in the other direction. I tend to think it's a wonderful adaptation that sometimes is let down by, like, I think you mentioned before the podcast, you haven't brought this up yet, but like the CGI is not the best all the time.
I maybe said Doctor Who CGI derisively, which, it's a television budget. I love Doctor Who. Please don't send angry fan letters. I love the Doctor. I'm excited for the new Doctor. I liked the last few Doctors. Wait, is this the Doctor Who podcast we've been planning? No.
I'm finally up to Capaldi, if that's any indication of
all
my
right.
Doctor Who devotion.
So I think it's a really good question, and it does seem like adaptations often have this problem of the 2 ends of the spectrum, the people who have no attachment to it, don't care, or the hardcore devotees just
Yeah.
hate it because it changes it. The dynamics there, I think, are tricky for any show to manage.
Yeah.
I will say the other thing that was on my mind. Well, and who am I? Again, if we have some new listeners, welcome. One of the dynamics I
Yeah.
bring is I just compare it to other things I've read before, or in this case, watched. So it definitely felt to me like the experience of watching the first Harry Potter movie and the
Yeah.
first Lord of the Rings movie. Now, these 22 years ago, I think, since those came out.
Woof.
Yeah, oof. Mortality, man. So I always remember around the time of those two adaptations, there was a really good article I read about kind of a psychological phenomenon, which is part of the problem with Harry Potter movies being made, period, is that kids had developed this wonderful connection to the character and they had their image of Harry Potter and Hermione and Ron and all of that. And then you see a movie and your brain just naturally then slots in those actors in those roles. And so I
Yeah.
will say we haven't been doing that much reading since we first watched these episodes, but I found myself already doing that I'm like, oh, I'm now picturing Perrin from the show instead of kind of the version of Perrin I had in my head. And that's absolutely true for me for Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings. It's just a thing that happens, not really a thing I like or dislike. I guess it happened
Yeah.
for me in Game of Thrones too. Um, so on the larger scale, though, I think, for me, what makes a successful adaptation, and I'd love your thoughts on what a successful adaptation is I think it's folly to expect it to follow every single piece of the material. It's just,
Yeah.
a great comic book movie shouldn't just be the comic book set to motion. It should be something new and different. To me, each medium is its own thing. And so you have to adapt the story to it. So then instead of asking for fidelity, I ask for thematic resonance, right?
Yeah.
If I love the first book of Wheel of Time as a coming of age story of these characters finding each other and discovering the larger world outside their valley, I'm already like hesitant about spoilers. Then that's what I want. I want to see that, and I want it to be fun. And the we've talked on our book show a lot about the world building, and so then it's like, well,
Yeah.
I got to see the world building, and I got to see these characters and factions and locations that I've been really interested in. And so all of that is to say, in these first couple episodes, there were definitely some moments where I was like fist pump, like, yes, that's exactly how I pictured it. That's really great.
Yeah.
There were also some like, that's a lot different than I expected. And I even had a couple like, oh, I kind of missed that piece. Now I'm
Yeah.
not like, oh, I got to burn it down. I hate everything because they skipped Tom Bombadil. But I am like, you said it, they got to shorten this up. They got to trim it down. And so the things they cut to me are more of interest than they are reason to say Amazon killed my childhood. I say that for other reasons, but
Yeah, that's fair. So I think to me, then there are kind of two pieces within this that I think are worth talking about. So one is things that were cut, right? Things that we expected to be in these first couple episodes that are gone. From my perspective, I'm personally never someone who is really defensive of material being cut, unless it is something that I think is really important for a character moment, right? I get really worried when like a pivotal change in a character gets left out. But in general, I am very okay with moving around plot or moving around world building details if you keep the people who I have met in these books, who they were, at least at the core. That's, to me, what I really look for in fidelity. So when I see things getting cut, I'm often looking for like, okay, is that something that I think is tied to a defining thing in this character? And if it is, how do they replace that, right? How do they keep this character who they were before, or how does it change the character? There is also then, I think, tied up in that, what you were saying is not necessarily what is removed or what is added, but what is basically kept mostly the same, but it looks just enough different that it might set off bells if you had a particular image in your head. I'm thinking, for example, the fact that it's multiracial casting, right? I
Mm.
think, and I think we mentioned this in the first few episodes of the podcast when we were talking about the book. There are references in the book to Rand being lighter skin than all of the other members of the Two Rivers, or all of the people in the Two Rivers have dark skin and dark eyes and dark hair. And that can be either read as being, as a lot of the people, including the people who have drawn the covers of the books, they have largely interpreted that as like olive skin or a dark tan. Whereas I think it could also be read as people who are, people of color. And so it's one of those interesting things where I don't think you can say this does not stick to the book, but it certainly doesn't stick to how many people pictured the book in their head. And that's a really interesting and delicate line to kind of dance if you're a show creator.
Well, and what comes to mind there is, I think I said this the night we watched it. Your default in your head in fantasy, despite all the signals that were given, goes to like medieval Europe. And that's just what fantasy looked like for a long time. So you're not getting that. And I'm going to, for one, applaud that. Yes, take my virtue signaling, send me a medal. No, it shouldn't be, right? Fantasy is for all of us. Sci-fi, it drives me crazy when people get mad about people of color in Star Wars. It's like, why are they all white people? Like, or should they be?
Yeah, I have never understood policing the race of fictional things. Like they're fictional. Who
Yeah. Yeah,
cares?
exactly. Exactly. So, what comes to mind in what you were just pointing out is Hunger Games, actually. So Hunger Games had a character named Rue, who was described as, I think it's Rue, as dark-skinned in the book. Cast her as a black girl in the movie, and people freaked out. And that was, an early example of one of these rounds. And then in Harry Potter, again, Hermione is pictured as beautiful Emma Watson now, or cute young Emma Watson, depending on which movie you're watching. But in the Broadway show, they cast her as a black actress, and people freaked out. And I think J.K. Rowling, I don't really want to be on her side on any issues, but I think she in this case pointed out like her main descriptor is that she has bushy hair, and that could easily apply to anybody of either race. So it shouldn't be seen as different. So I do think that what the show is fighting is less correcting, quote unquote, Robert Jordan's vision than it is correcting the psychological choices we all make along the way. And to that point, I would point out, I made a joke as the show started, and you get this opening chase scene with, I believe it's Lan and somebody else, or no, it's not, it's Logain, and someone else.
It is actually not Logain. It is just an unnamed channeler.
Okay.
And a number of Red Aja Aes Sedai, but we don't have names for any of them yet.
And I was, a few good quality sips into my Negroni, and I was like, I was expecting top knots, but not this many top knots. And you just were like, then you didn't read the descriptions. And first of all, good joke. Second of all, just like that is a part of it. Like whatever they described Lan as, I fill in the version of Lan that's in my head. And again, this wasn't Lan in this case, but Lan is an Asian actor in the show. And I think, you just default. And so trying to make sure, no, this is meant to be around the world. And so the last point I'll make on it is Amazon made a big splash lately buying a very expensive show that they could sell to a global audience. And there's a cynical voice that would say they did multiracial casting only for that. I don't think that's true at all. I think they just wanted to make a fantasy world that looks like our world, including all of its, dimensions.
The closest thing that I have to like actual information is that one time I went to an event where the executive producer of the Amazon Wheel of Time television show talked about things, and I asked him a couple of questions, and then he asked to see my Wheel of Time tattoo. So that interaction, one of the things that I actually really took out of it that I found really fascinating was him talking about how the switch in perspective that we see in the books, Rand is very much the main viewpoint character, in the television show, it's Moraine seems to be really forward in these first two episodes, and that's a major shift, kind of in the same way we're talking about shifts in racial dynamics or makeups. And one of the things that the producer said is like, when we took this to some other studios, that was like a little bit of hesitancy around having a woman in the lead role and really switching the focus. And when we took it to Amazon, it was like, yeah, that's what they wanted. That's what they were looking for. They knew that they had Wheel of Time coming out. Or not Wheel of Time. They knew that they had Lord of the Rings coming up. They wanted to make sure that they had like some, options for fantasy that wasn't just like straight, white bread down the middle. And so they were really thrilled with that. So that's information I know he said in other interviews. I'm not like spilling the beans or anything, but I think that shows us something about how they approached this story. It was very much like, we want to be true to the books, but also kind of modernize the representation as much as possible. And yay, I'm happy.
Yeah. It's an old Arrested Development joke, and not even a very famous one, where they note when Judge Reinhold gets executive producer on mock trial with Judge Reinhold, they go, he got executive producer, good for him. And I had that exact moment actually watching the opening of the second episode, where it was like, oh, Rosamund Pike, she's a producer on this. Like,
Yeah.
clearly. So the fact that they not only move Moraine to the center, I didn't recognize anybody else in the. Oh, that's a lie. You helped me. I recognize one other guy. We'll talk about that. But primarily, I didn't know any other names of any of these actors except for her, and the fact that she's taking a more, I believe it was a producer role, not even an executive producer role, and. As I understand those two titles, producer means you actually do work, whereas executive producer can often be a vanity credit, especially for talent on a show.
It is either a vanity credit or you were in charge of all of the money. And so it's a weird, like, one or the other, very important or nothing. She also, it's worth noting, if you are enjoying Rosamund Pike as Moraine, she has now narrated the first 3 books in audiobook format. I have not had a chance to listen, but I've heard they're absolutely spectacular. The originals have 2 voice actors. I've listened to those. It's one for male characters and one for female characters. Also outstanding, but I've heard a lot of people who normally defend the original audiobook recordings saying the Rosamund Pike ones are A+, even better. So she's clearly very invested in the story and the fandom and really wanting to be involved. So I'm super thrilled to see it more than anything else. Like, it's great to have a lead actor who's that into the material.
Yeah, and I want to hesitate to say it's like necessary, because I do think especially actresses get this thrown at them a lot, like, well, you don't even know them.
Yeah.
Like, it was surprising to me when Rosario Dawson, coming out as Ahsoka, had to like explain how long she's loved Star Wars and how young she was, and it's like, no, it can also just be a job, and that's okay. Let's not require this high bar that any actor has to meet, but particularly actresses, just because male nerds are super toxic in general. So that's really exciting to see, and it sounds to me like it's something then that is very personal to her and not just a paycheck. Certainly, that evidence is there, and I look forward to, as we move towards the second season here, checking out. I'm sure she'll do a press circuit as a part of that. I noted, I think it was more in styling. I was thinking of Rosamund Pike from Gone Girl, and she's like, badass, super crazy. Like sly in a good way in that movie,
and crazy like not in a good way in
true.
that movie.
And I kind of noted it was, well, I think that movie's pretty old at this point, so it's probably just time, but also I was like, oh, she seems styled to be a little older, a little more matronly feels like an insult to a Hollywood actress, but it shouldn't be. But it's, the role is meant to be the kind of person leading and corralling these kids, and so I'm going to use that as a transition to say, I will say my big surprise, and I know a big change in the adaptation, is that they shifted the ages of the characters a bit to have a little fun and to do things a little differently.
Yeah, like 3-4 years.
Yeah. So talk to me about why you think they shifted. Let's just talk about the main 4 for the moment. Like, why do you think they shifted them up? What do you think this change represents?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of things here, some of them practical, some of them creative. I think number one, the biggest challenge that you are always going to run into with casting someone who looks 16 is that if you need them to do 3 seasons at age 16, they're not going to look 16 by the end of those seasons. And so I obviously don't want to give away how much time the Wheel of Time takes up or what is coming in terms of kind of the length of what we're looking at. But to some degree, I think casting people to look 21 is just much easier to do if you need them to look that age for several seasons than casting people to look 16, 17, right? We've all watched the like fourth season of like 90210 and we're just like, that is not a high schooler, y'all. So I think some of it is that. Some of it I think is a desire, probably just with the nature of what fantasy television has become in the post post Game of Thrones era, is there's to some degree we're looking for adult fantasy rather than like kid fantasy. And so I think removing a little bit of the coming of age story, or at least aging it up a bit, I think helps with that a good degree. And then I'll be honest, I think probably a decent chunk of it after that is just like it's easier. It's just an easier story to tell with characters of this age as opposed to a younger age. It's easier to find actors who are competent to handle those roles. It's easier to write for adults as opposed to writing for, as we've said, Robert Jordan in the books has done an outstanding job of dancing around the fact that teenagers make dumb decisions, but it's a lot easier to write for like mentally stable 20 somethings. Not to say all 20 somethings are stable, but they're more stable than 16-year-olds, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, and the recent comparison is what I think can be deemed the unsuccessful show Willow on Disney Plus. I know it has fans, one of whom is a close friend of ours who is, ready to get the tattoo. But that show stuck to a pretty young cast. I don't know the ages of each of those people, but they were very believable as
Yeah.
teenagers. And I think one of the criticisms, I don't even want to spread it generally. One of the things I had trouble with is I just didn't think the acting was very good. And actually Warwick Davis was a part of that. So it wasn't even the young people, but
Yeah.
I think it is a good point that you need slightly older people who just have those skills. I mean,
Yeah.
again, the Harry Potter movies, it takes until like the fifth one where you're like, okay, Daniel Radcliffe can do this now and
Yeah.
is really good. And it took, having a job where every famous British actor came in for a couple
Yep.
months and showed him how to act. So I think that was there. And then I was just gonna allude, keeping this in our family friendly thing. There is sex in the first episode, which
Yeah.
is surprising, and I think you had to age up the characters to have sex. And certainly, as that romantic scene was started, I was like, "Oh, is this about to be Game of Thrones?" And you know, the, I found myself being like, I don't want that. No, stop. Like I
Yeah.
was really worried, the famous phrase from Game of Thrones is sex position. It's like, oh, we're going to drop some dialogue and to keep you interested, we're just going to show a topless woman usually. And so I was like, oh no, is that what they did? And so I will say I was relieved to see that they kind of kept to the spirit of the books and didn't adultify it too far in that direction. Some teenagers, it makes sense. It's not like it shouldn't be a part of their world. But it was certainly surprising that kind of chaste will they, won't they was a like, oh, we've been doing it. I don't mean doing it, but
Right.
we've been anyway, I'll stop talking.
Yeah, they've been doing it. It's fine. That's an accurate description. I think that for me, some of this is a kind of effective writer's strategy, right? It's much easier to write a mature relationship breaking up and make that into drama that can carry you over a season than it is to write like, teenage flirty stuff and then turn that into something that will go for a season. I am admiring Greg just out of the air blew a moth or something and hit it perfectly. That was amazing.
Not quite Obama with his fly that he got mid, but I don't know what that thing was. It was something bigger and dumber than your average fly. So,
uh, so I think some of what is going on here is that it's writing them into a situation where they can do drama better and they can write it more
Mm,
believably and more effectively. I think that works really well. What I find really fascinating is that Rand and Egwene basically just have their previous situation aged up, right? They
mm,
are older. Like you say, we are now dealing with a sexual relationship as opposed to a pretty chaste relationship. But otherwise, like they're in basically the same place they were before. Matt suddenly has bad parents and twin sisters who need his looking after, and Perrin suddenly has a wife. So when we're
yeah.
talking about aging up, I think Rand is a good place to start because he is the least impacted by this change.
Mm.
What were your thoughts on kind of the major shifts for those two? And let's also not forget the fact that Nynaeve is kind of our last kind of big character from the Two Rivers we're introduced to. In the books, she doesn't get a whole lot of background other than like, oh, she can heal people really good. Here we get she's from another town. We learn that she was trained by someone who wanted to be an Aes Sedai and couldn't. There's a lot kind of more digging into the background of that character. And I think some of that is enabled by the fact that she's more mature and more willing to stand up for herself when talking to Moraine. So, what are your thoughts on those three changes as we kind of leap forward in time?
So I'm gonna bracket Nynaeve for the first part of this, but I will say clearly to me the goal for actually I'll include Nynaeve in this comment. The goal here is if we are going to eventually split our time between these characters in separate groups, I think the writers saw it as necessary that we care about all of them and we gave
Yeah.
them that depth, that deeper character, so that we understand what's going on. I think it was most surprising to me. I would put Matt at the most surprising because he was presented as such a trickster kind of fool in the book in a lot of ways that it was surprising to put him in the role of he's been protecting his twin sisters because of these irresponsible parents. That's not really necessarily fair, but parents with their own troubles that have kind
Yeah.
of left the sisters to neglect, and he's fulfilled that role. That certainly didn't feel like Matt from the books, yet I do find that to be a more compelling character.
Yeah.
It's then super surprising that he's like, okay, I'm still going. Like, see you later. And so you're left to wonder about that. And I have some questions about how long the show will go without checking in on Two Rivers. And I won't spoil anything at all, but it certainly makes me more interested in what's happening in Two Rivers than I was in this portion of the early book.
Yeah.
Thinking about it was kind of like when they left Two Rivers, I'm like, let's go, let's do this. To Perrin, yeah, it's really a shame. I mean,
Yeah.
we when we were in person, you said like, told you we weren't done talking about fridging, and it really just felt like Perrin isn't interesting enough in the books, quote unquote. So let's not only give him a wife, let's have him kill the wife and then have him hiding the fact that he killed his wife as they start this adventure. Right? I have that complexity
That
correctly.
is correct. Let
Yeah.
me say, the one defense I have of this, and
Yeah.
it's pretty damn indefensible, right? Don't get me wrong. This is a straight up fridging. It is creating a female character to immediately murder her for the betterment of a male character's story. Woof. That being said, I think Perrin is a character in this first book who is really defined to some degree by his like control or lack thereof, right? Early on in the book, it's about like Perrin always being deliberate and thoughtful. And then later on in the book, we haven't reached this point in the television show, but there are a few moments where Perrin kind of loses control and it really influences his future story. And so the one kind of advantage I see of Perrin having a loss early on in the series is that you get to see him experience that kind of lack of control much earlier than you would get in the book, right? It's several hundred pages before you see that first moment for Perrin in the books. Here, they introduce that dilemma earlier, which I think gives you a lot more to play with. He doesn't feel like an empty shell for the equivalent of 3 or 4 episodes. But this was a really, I think, lightly misogynistic way to accomplish that, I think, very admirable goal.
Yes. I mean, I think there's nothing else to say about that. Um, well, maybe just to say it is shocking. Like, you meet that wife, and
Yeah.
knowing what we knew from the book, I was like, well, she's not long for this story, even
Yeah.
if it's not a death. And so I had assumed just she'll get taken down by the Trollocs, and to have this extra tragic turn on top of that,
Yeah.
that is certainly compelling. I mean, not that that's a defense of it, but it is, in terms of a fridging, it's doing its job. It's giving Perrin something really interesting to deepen his character.
Super fun fact. The wife character's name is the name of a random person who is mentioned only in the prologue that we read and discuss in the first episode of Through the Glass Columns.
You mean one of the two prologues that were entirely trimmed out of the television show?
Yeah, that's
I better
correct.
go listen to episode 1 of Through the Glass episode 2, actually, probably, of Through the
That's
Glass Columns to learn more about that. Actually, I assume that's from the prologue that I wasn't surprised they cut. I
yeah.
was surprised they cut the other one. One thing we haven't
Watch
talked
and
that
find
much.
out.
Oh, okay. One of the things we haven't talked that much about is not only is this an adaptation, but it's also playing the pilot game, right? And a
Yeah.
good television pilot has to present a fully rendered world with enough for you to learn about it that you absolutely want to watch future episodes. And I'm sure we could have a long debate about which television pilot is like the quintessential perfect one. I think Mad Men and Breaking Bad belong in that discussion, but I don't even know if I would settle on either of those at the top. But as a pilot, I thought I was surprised that as it teased larger mysteries, it left out the prologue, and
Yeah.
so we can talk about the prologue. The prologue that shows the breaking of the world seemed to me like a really kind of cool thing to show at the beginning of the book. And so I was surprised it wasn't here.
Yeah.
And it seemed to rely much more on Moraine and her powers. It talked more in these episodes about the rules than we got at all in this point of the book. We didn't learn about the only speaks the truth until the second book, and it's here in the second episode. I don't
Yeah.
think I just broke one of our rules. I think I
No, you're
followed
good.
that correctly. And we even learned more about those rules that we haven't learned from the books that we learned in the show.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting to me that they seem to have shifted some of that larger world to be more specifically about the Aes Sedai and Moraine specifically. I would say if I was a producer, I would argue that there were so many layers in the book that maybe a TV audience doesn't need that many layers. So instead, to move some of that other material to hook them on some of the layers that are more important early on and save the bigger stuff for later would be
Yeah.
my interpretation of that.
Yeah, I found what they were trying to do really interesting. It felt like they were saying, we want to be a little more adult. Let's age up the characters. We would like to kind of highlight the fact that the more this series goes on, the more it becomes, very female forward. I'd say probably in the later, section of the series, we probably get more POVs from female characters than male ones. But you've read the first book. That ain't the case in the first book.
Yeah.
And so I think to some degree, they're trying to take advantage of what works in the later books and kind of bring it in a little bit earlier in the series, right? Have this kind of female focus, bring in, like you're saying, the parts of the world building that are really interesting and accessible right off the gate. And what I find really interesting is in the book, is Moraine actually a good person? Is a really tense thought in the early whole first book, more or less.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, in the series, by trying to make Moraine kind of the center of the series, what you do is you basically create a situation where you get rid of one of the kind of things that creates tension in the book series. And what I think is really interesting at the end of the first episode is it seems like the TV show is trying to replace the tension of is Moraine good or evil with instead the tension of who is the dragon reborn, right? I don't want to give away too much from the books, but I think that is not something that is super in doubt pretty early in the series. it is very much in doubt, at least at the end of the 2 episodes that we have watched. So I think that is their attempt to try to say, I know we're simplifying, but let's add this new twist to it. But I'm not sure it's entirely effective, especially as at some point we'll need to discuss 8 episodes is a real short order for a book of this length.
Yes. Well, so how do they achieve that? I would say we meet Moraine first
Yep.
instead of meeting Rand first, which is, Dan Harmon of Rick and Morty and Community always discuss like all you have to do is introduce a character and we're already sympathetic with them, right? Like
Yeah.
your audience, you fade in on a dog chasing a squirrel and the audience automatically is like, that squirrel man. I really identify with that squirrel. And it feels exactly like that. Like, let's just shift it over a little and make this a little more Moraine story. Also, the her arrival in Two Rivers felt like it felt like we were really following her and these people just happened to interact with her. So some of the perspective there was shifted over as a part of that. The tension about whether she's good or not, I think, is gone from those scenes. And then her counterpoint is Nynaeve, and I bracketed her and I want to unbracket her to say, I think I was a bad reader, and I confessed this to you the night we watched the episodes. I definitely was picturing like someone in her 50s probably as Nynaeve. And I think it's the role of the wisdom, kind of wielding the power in the town and being healing. I just mentally, I don't think I could even describe her physically. She feels like an older figure. I think part of that is in the first book, how she doesn't come along and then has followed to protect these kids in the book. And that's all been shifted around here a little bit. So I was shocked at how young Nynaeve was. You said she basically got the same treatment as the other characters, right?
Maybe slightly less. I think in the books she's like 5 years older. She's only like 3 or 4 older in the show.
And certainly just looks like a young person, like looks like she could be the same age as them. And so I would say all of that was a surprise to me, both because of poor reading, but some of those choices. And I think some of her backstory might then be to like, oh, the most interesting thing about Nynaeve in this first book is kind of her being the only one who questions Moraine, right? And kind of calls BS on a lot of Moraine's kind of half truths. I know they're literal truths, but
I do just want to know, as we're talking about all of these similarities and differences between Nynaeve in the show and the book, the biggest one is that she is not presumed dead at this point in the book, right? It's not until the very end of the second episode that we get the like shocking reveal Nynaeve is not dead. That shocking reveal is not a thing in the book. She is presumed alive the entire time.
Well, and to way back to your original question, that's a really interesting choice because book readers are going to be like, no way, like she's not dead. I was just listening to a podcast about the Rise of Skywalker and how they kill off Chewbacca for 2 minutes and 5 seconds. And it's like, the question was like, why? Like, you should either lean into that and really make it like a solid 15 minutes or not bother. And I think, there's a little bit of a different dynamic here, but it's reminiscent of that in that it's like, if you're a book reader, you're like, she's not dead. Like, she's way too big a part of this to be cut out like that. So there's no tension in that choice from us. For show watchers, I imagine you met a bunch of people in Two Rivers and it just felt like somebody who was taken out and to make it clear the Trollocs were a threat.
So fake out characters are a thing.
So I think it's a really interesting choice. I think the effect on me is that I was like, oh, this is a much cooler Nynaeve. And I mean that in the like high school sense. Like she should have a leather jacket and sit in the chair backwards, or what have you. Like, Nynaeve is not an old fuddy-duddy worrying about the kids. She seems like a kind of active hero, more so at this point than I would have said in the book whatsoever. Actually, I think in the book, we hadn't even met her again yet. No, that's not quite right. We had met her again.
I don't know if she would actually. Oh, yeah, by Shadar Lagoth, she would have. This is actually worth noting. There is a couple towns that are in between Shadar Lagoth and the Two Rivers that are non-existent in the television show, which good. It's not
Uh-huh.
600 pages long, but there's a lot of editing there that I'm actually very, very okay with. I know we haven't been taking this kind of like in episode order at any point, really, but this feels like we're kind of talking about the end of episode one. Was there anything else from the first episode that stood out to you before we kind of jump into episode two? And any last thoughts? I'm kind of cognizant we try to keep these about an hour, so that'll leave us like 15, 20 minutes to talk about the second episode.
I would only say the one thing that hasn't gotten any commentary yet is the fact that all of the Rand's father questions are cut out.
Yes.
Right. So a lot of the action happens the same way, but there's no. I'm already forgetting his dad's name.
Tam.
Tam. Tam is still injured, still gets taken to be healed in Two Rivers, but doesn't at all kind of reveal that Ram might have a different father or
Yeah.
some of those kind of, so the start of that. Um that was really interesting to me because that has been such a major part of the first book discussion and into the second book. I'm not spoiling anything because we still don't know all the answers in that mystery. But here it's like, oh, let's not bother with that. Let's just,
Yeah.
there are some references to that he's tall still and that he's kind of different looking.
Yeah.
Um, but certainly not the level that we had seen at this point in the book. So that was my real surprise. I think that was the one thing I commented on before the credits rolled. I'm like, we're just skipping that? And you're like,
Uh,
shut up. I'm drinking Negroni.
there is one more thing that I do want to mention if we're talking about things that are not in episode one. Um, for those of you who haven't read the books, we're about to talk about something that may or may not show up in the television show. But where in the world is Tom?
Yeah.
That's a person who is in the books and is not in the show at all in the first two episodes. I have no need for you to comment otherwise. Just where is Tom?
Well, we should also reveal. So the person I did recognize that wasn't Rosamund Pike is Patton Fane came in, and I was like, oh, that guy's really familiar. Who's that actor? And you, because you'd seen the show, pulled up your phone and looked through, and were like, he's not in anything. Like these are not. Oh, I guess he's in like Love Actually, and I responded immediately with the role he plays and some of his lines in Love Actually. So
Yep.
take that, world that expects me to not have bad taste in Christmas movies. I identified him immediately. Yeah, let's talk about the second episode.
Yeah, I mean, so the second episode to me is broken down into very much like the travel section with all of the kind of drama that comes around it and the dreams and what have you, and then Shadar Lagoth. So in the initial kind of travel section, I need to make sure if we're only going to talk about one thing in this episode, it needs to be the singing of the song about Manetheren and the fact that Moraine's speech is almost word for word the same as in the books. I love every second of it, even though it is kind of a slow scene, all told. I don't know
Mm.
whether that one stood out to you at all, but it is brilliant in my book.
I agree. The singing of songs is really hard to adapt, and look no further than the Hobbit films, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
such a major part of the Hobbit is the singing of these goofy songs, and then you put them in real life, and they don't really work. I actually would give Lord of the Rings. I think it's Fellowship of the Rings more credit because Gandalf sings one of the songs kind of
Yep.
in a meditative moment as smoking his pipe and I mean, let's call it what it is, getting high and singing a song. Uh, that I thought was really well the way they one bring it up and they all just kind of harmonized and brought it
Uh-huh.
together. It was actually kind of lovely as just
Yeah.
a moment. And then Moraine's that was a nice bit of performance. I
Yeah.
mean, we're so far since this season aired. I know she didn't win an Emmy. Was she nominated for this at
I
all?
don't believe so.
That's a shame because she did really nice on that. That would have been the scene to submit for your
Yeah.
Emmy, I would say.
100%. I think the other thing that stands out to me in this early section is that as viewers, I feel like we are not necessarily in the is Moraine good or bad camp. We kind of see a lot of detail that, obviously the first episode is dedicated to getting us to believe her and think that she is taking them on an adventure. But a decent chunk of this first half of the second episode is pretty much dedicated to the kids arguing about whether or not they should keep going with Moraine and all of the kind of progressively worse things she's doing with the ferry and, all of these, just bad things that are happening to them along the road. So I think that there is something to be said for why is it that the showrunners took out our doubt about Moraine, but kind of kept it in for the characters? Because I think their scenes still work, but they work as drama. They don't work as mystery, if that makes sense. So it's a pretty big change in tone, but I think one that I don't necessarily mind. I'm a Bridgerton fan. I have no problem with drama in my television shows.
Hmm. Well, I'm a Love Actually fan, so I guess we're just turning in our man cards tonight. That's fine. They weren't worth having anyway. So it's a good question to think about, kind of the goal in that and the purpose of that. I think because they're aged up, these questions seem very serious too,
Yeah.
right? I would also put that in the mix, that these are adults thinking through this big change. And so I like that if this were 16-year-olds debating, you'd be like, yeah, kids shouldn't follow a weird lady into the woods as a
Yeah.
part of that. I also think the editorial choices just meant that they left very abruptly, and
Mm-hmm.
all those connections they had, the wife, the sisters, all of that is like, you just threw that all aside and trusted this woman. So I like, kind of, in the heat of the moment, you run away with her and then you're like, wait, what did I just do? Like, what did I sign up for? Um the comparison to me, I don't know why. I guess I'm in a rom-com mood. I was thinking of Jerry Maguire, where
Yeah.
Renee Zellweger's like, I'll go with you. And it's like, oh crap. Like, I'm now in this situation. So I think those choices are really, they the decision to make us 100% on Moraine's side could have easily turned those choices into like, these are silly kids, but I think
Right.
they actually help deepen our wisdom. And how I kind of come to that conclusion is, I picture without them, like, if they just kept going, we'd be like, what? Like,
Yeah.
you just followed this woman and it seems like a plot contrivance. And instead we're saying like, no, they're asking good questions and they're thinking about this.
Yeah.
Now, from
Uh,
that part of the episode, I want to ask you about the White Cloaks. So
yeah.
this is earlier than the White Cloaks should be in our world, right? I
Yeah.
remember Ben, our friend who was watching with us, turned to us and was like, "Whoa, like this is early, right?" So
Yeah.
talk to me, because it also wasn't Jephram, the White Cloak I expected it to be. So talk to me a little bit about this.
Yes, I'm actually going to be doing the world's quickest Google for a second while we are doing this, because I think Jeffrey Bornhold may actually appear in that episode, just not as the main White Cloak.
Hmm.
That being said, this episode, I think that introducing the White Cloaks early makes sense. I really
Hmm.
appreciate this change. And I think part of it is just how you deliver world building in a television show versus how you do in a book, right? In a book, you can do, here is a 5-page info dump on the White Cloaks. Now let's see how they interact with you. In a television show, you kind of need to see someone be intimidating without anything else going on before you kind of believe them in an intimidating scene later on where other things are happening and your characters are doing whatever they're doing. So I think this is a really smart choice. I think it works really well. The thing that is interesting to me is that this is very much used as a way to highlight the danger that even Moraine and Lan are in. And that's something that I think comes across very differently in the books, where I feel like it is always the Trollocs that are the real scariest thing while those two characters are around, because they can, kill a warder or kill an Aes Sedai.
Hmm.
But here, partially because we already know about the oaths, and so we know how kind of boxed in Moraine is, I find the White Cloaks to be actually a little bit scarier on the show than you kind of can make them in a short period of time in one book.
Yeah, and so thinking about the structure of the show as well, I think I'm correct in saying this is the opening scene of this episode, correct?
So the opening scene is the introduction where the character is burning
Right.
the witch at the stake, and then we later on get the confrontation between Moraine and Valda.
Right. So certainly that makes a lot of sense. Again, you come out of your pilot, you've introduced a few wrinkles, And now you peel back another big piece of the world building to put in at the start of the second episode to kind of say, oh, you thought you understood all the dangers. There's actually this larger plot. I haven't watched further, but it certainly wouldn't surprise me if we got something else folded in the early in the next episode to kind of keep that going, and maybe that's where we'll find the missing prologue or something else. So I think that it is really effective. And the other piece that's really effective is, in some ways, I think, when we talked in our book one discussion about the symbol that represents the white cloaks, we talked about how it's kind of a mix of light and dark compared to some of the other chapter symbols, which are very heavily light or very heavily dark. And it was interesting to me. I would say that the opening scene is just so powerfully dark.
Yeah.
It's very much like, this is a threat that is so overwhelming. And we've seen that in our reading, that a new threat will be introduced in kind of a fashion that makes you like quiver and say like, oh my God, like this is way worse than I thought these other villains were. And so I think that this is kind of the TV version of that. Let's fold in the white cloaks. Let's make them really evil, not in a way that doesn't match what we saw in the show, but it intensifies it, or what we've seen implied in the books is made manifest in the show in a way that is really upsetting.
Yeah.
And then to your point about the second scene where they encounter them, something that unsettles Lan and Moraine is very unsettling, because these are the characters we've come attached to, and we can see how unsettled they are. The fact, when she takes off her ring and Lan hides the ring, it felt very biblical to me, of like, I will renounce you 3 times, or you will renounce me 3 times before the sun comes up, or whatever. It was like, oh, she's so afraid that she's going to betray who she is entirely, or what she believes in. So that's really effective. But I will also say I was just a huge fan of the fact that they just walked off, because then it's like, yep, it's out there. They're in the mix. Wait till they show back up. And that felt very Robert Jordan to me, to just like, yep, here's a little something. We'll show you more later. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, and I think the thing that was really effective for me in that scene is you talked about how the white cloaks in the show are just like starkly, seemingly evil, whereas in the book they're a little more gray. I think the reason why is because of the white cloak we're meeting. I did look it up. I was correct. In that scene where they are on the road, they initially speak to a white-haired white cloak who... That is Joffrey Bornhald. He initially allows them to leave, and then Eamon Valda, the white cloak who we had met in the introduction of the episode, questions them further. So I think that is partially what's going on here, is instead of being initially introduced to Bornhald, who is kind of a moderate in the white cloaks, we're instead first introduced to Valda, who is nothing remotely close to moderate. So I think that's an effective choice, right? In a book, sometimes you can kind of give the kind of vibe of an organization through things other than the character, and then play that against a more moderate character. On television, where you've got maybe 5 minutes of screen time in this first introduction to the White Cloaks total, I think it makes sense to go for, a little bit more of a hardcore introduction, because it really kind of lays out what the group is and why we should be worried about them in a more stark way. So I think it works, but it definitely changes the look at the organization entirely. We've talked about them as being a shade of gray in the world a lot. They are nothing remotely close to a shade of gray in the television show.
And 2 visual aspects that reinforce that. The chain with all the rings on it is deeply unsettling, because we just watched a horrific experience that earned him one of those. And so we can only imagine what all those represent. And perhaps the stupidest observation I have, hey, the white cloaks sure look like the Klan. And there's a way in which a description of men in white cloaks doesn't really necessarily register that. Like seeing a group of 8 dudes on horses wearing white cloaks, you're like, oh, it's the Klan. Duh.
Yep.
And so
Robert Jordan's a Southerner. That is what he is drawing on.
Absolutely. And so there's a way in which, it not only works to make them a little more extreme, but the visuals just reinforce that. And highly effective. I was certainly more unsettled by them in that scene than I had been in any of the more intense scenes we've read in the book, certainly.
Yeah, I mean, do you have anything else to say about this section of the episode? Because I think it is time to talk about the climactic finish, Shadar Lagoth. Anything before we get there?
No, I think let's go to the City of Shadows. And I certainly was surprised we were there already. It was like,
Yeah.
whoa, like, but that's you said it. I mean, if you only have 8 episodes, you gotta move. And we skipped Bear Lawn. I had remembered Bear Lawn as like the log cabin city that wasn't actually a real city.
Yep.
And then we get to the Shadar Lagoth, and
Mhm.
it's huge, way bigger than I
Yeah.
imagined it personally when we read the book.
Yeah, and I think that this is one of the more effective moments of lore dropping, right? One of the challenges I think with a television show is how do you explain what Shadar Lagoth, nay Eridhall, is in a short enough period of time that it's not just a giant monologue. And so I think having Lan deliver that is a really effective way of making it all feel concrete and making you really listen because he talks so little. And then Matt being Matt afterwards was perfect. It's a really solid joke of like, that's the most I've ever heard you talk in history. Um, I also really loved the really effective detail I thought of no score, no background music, silence other than in many cases like horse hoof clops. I thought that worked really well. What was your takeaway? I know you said the scope worked really well for you. Was there anything else about Shadar Lagoth that jumped out as like, ooh, that was effective?
Absolutely the art design.
Yeah.
A shadow city is a city which looks like it should be vibrant and full of color, and it's just totally washed clean and grayed out like it had been erased a little bit. And I think that that becomes even more effective when the shadow starts chasing them and just kind of taking it all.
I think the
Uh,
bright red of the ruby stands out so well against that. That
yeah.
design works really well.
Yes. And so all of that was really effective. There's a little bit of cheesiness in how it divides up the characters and those things, the kind of how you move the pieces around isn't like 100% effective. In a recent book episode, although it's not recent for when people are hearing this, we discussed the end of Force Awakens, where like suddenly the planet opens up because you just need to preserve the two characters to duel
Yeah.
in episode 8. And there were parts of this that felt like that. Like we just gotta, and we knew this as book readers, like we just gotta separate these characters into these parties that they'll be in for this kind of middle third of the book, or I
Yeah.
don't know,
Something like that.
somewhere around there. And so it felt like I just knew we had to do that. And some of it felt a little cheesy, but of the effects, I think the Trollocs were the least successful for me. I think the magic was in the middle. And I'd actually put the shadow towards the top, that it
Yeah.
really was effectively unsettling. It was not a complicated effect, which is in my mind why that makes it a little
Yeah.
easier to buy.
Yeah, I will say if we're talking about like effects that work, there is one specific moment in the first episode where a rope of magic dissects a Trolloc, and it is the worst visual I have seen in a long time. That's the one that broke me. I'm a big believer on this show that the CGI is pretty good and the practical effects are really good. And so
Mm,
with Trollocs, I think that um, you can see the difference, right? When the CG
yeah.
Trollocs, I'm like, this does not work. When you see practical Trollocs, I think it works really effectively. That I think is why the Shadar Lagoth effect worked really well, is because most of what sells it is the horse's reaction and the character's
Mm,
reaction. And then they kept it simple enough that it's just like if the characters are reacting to it, it doesn't matter how scary it looks. It just needs to look accurate in the world. And you can do that with a simple effect. I'm glad they did. One thing related to this, as we're talking about like production quality and stuff like this, shortly after this show aired, Amazon actually announced that they were going to be launching basically like a film school slash boot camp
mm,
to try to basically improve the quality. They said like we're working in Eastern Europe a lot, we're working in like Northern and Nordic Europe, and they were like the top teams really know their stuff. And once you get to like the second, third, fourth tier, it's like, we can do a little bit that would make them improve a lot. And so it sounds like hopefully over time, those production values will be going up a bit as hopefully that initiative, creates some real high quality productions.
Well, and I'm certainly not an expert on the special effects industry, but I will say the narrative that comes out is these teams are asked to do too much on too small a schedule for
Yep.
too little money. So if that is the best we can achieve, I think we're doing really well. It's actually a lot better than most Doctor Who. I
Oh
said
yeah.
that before. I think there's always been this gap, and something like the volume that they use on the Disney Star Wars shows is closing that somewhat, just making the budget a little more manageable. But if the choice is we have a few janky shots and get a show versus we don't get a show, then of course I'm
A hundred
for the
percent.
show and getting it. So, um, and like you pointed out, I can make fun of individual shots, but then something that's like the expansiveness of Shadar Lagoth, it doesn't look fake. It doesn't look
Yeah.
like blue screen. And there were a couple big moves, big shots in these. At the beginning of the first episode, it comes to the kind of pan up to reveal the kind of skyscrapers that have been grown over and kind of
Yeah.
become part of the landscape. Obviously, they're going to spend their budget on that. I always think about the first Lion Witch in the Wardrobe movie I saw with a friend who had a friend who worked in visual effects, and they were like, all the money went to Aslan. Everything else looks crappy because they got the fur on that lion exactly right.
Yep.
And I think it's an interesting question of what producers choose to spend the money on. And yeah, like, okay, the Trollocs aren't perfect, but Moraine's magic looks really good. And
Yeah.
that is more important to the storytelling. And you can see that calculation making a lot of sense. And I certainly can't quibble with it.
Yeah, and there are a few actually really good making of videos that Amazon put out, and a couple of them deal with visual effects. When we get to those, we can definitely pull them apart because there's some really cool stuff going on behind the scenes. Some of which I'm like, yeah, this is awesome, and some of it I'm like, okay, where did the money go? So we'll have lots of things to talk about as we go forward. That being said, in terms of like big plot points or big things to think about or mention, I'm kind of at the end of my list. Nynaeve unexpectedly showing up at the end of the episode is kind of the big twist, but we've covered it a little bit. Was there any last thoughts that you had just overall about the show, what worked, what didn't? I know I didn't take notes at all. I don't know whether you have any, but I guess I'm asking what are the last things on your notes that we haven't talked about?
Um, the ice cream was good.
Yeah.
The no. It was a good time. And again, I think it's cliche, but yet somehow worth saying that we are at peak TV. So
Yeah.
when we're critical, like we're holding this as a part of a conversation about the top tiers of shows, the most expensive ones. I don't think either of us watched Lord of the Rings yet. I don't
Not all the
know.
way through. Yeah.
Yeah. That seems to be what most people did.
Over 50%, according to statistics.
I had 6 months of free Prime and I did not watch it. And I got the free trial intending, I'm like, I'm gonna finally sit down and watch Lord of the Rings, and just never found the time in 6 months, which
Yep.
says something. Um, but I do think it's worth just acknowledging that our bar is pretty high. I'm somebody who watches way more movies than I watch television. So when I'm critical of the effects, I always try to like pause and think about, TV effects used to be Xena and Hercules, and we're
Yeah.
so far beyond kind of what used to be possible that we have to acknowledge that it's still pretty good. So my last note is not at all about these episodes, but I will say, so in my time as a film snob, I went out and saw what is the movie that is setting ablaze the Oscar race so far this year. So we are recording this in the summer of 2023, and the hot movie that seems to be where people think the Oscar race might actually start is this great film called Past Lives, which just came out in select cities like 3 weeks ago, and then it came to Boston last week. And I joke with Tylor. Tylor teaches at a college or university. Do you
College.
hide your college? Sometimes they hide it, but
Yeah.
a college with a bunch of film and film related programs, and there are definitely screenings I go to where I'm like, I'm with all your students just
Yeah.
off campus at the like art house screening of this film, and this was one of those. But I bring it up with purpose because it's this gorgeous little small film. It's a debut film by a director named Celine Song. It's very much a character piece. It's meditative. It's about the lives we choose and the lives we don't choose, blah, 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 blah. And I listened to a really good interview with her, and she's a playwright, and this is largely autobiographical. And so somebody in the interview was like, the interviewer was like, how did you do this? Like, how did you figure out how to be a film director after being a playwright and being very successful? And do you know the answer?
No.
She was in the writer's room for Wheel of Time. So
That's
she
awesome.
gave full credit to Wheel of Time and to the show, and how basically she had understood good writing, but she didn't understand how to construct a show and construct shots and do a film adaptation. So this kind of hot director of the moment in the indie art house is like, yeah, it was the showrunner on Wheel of Time who taught me everything, and I had a
That's super
fantastic
awesome.
experience in the writing room. So that is my endorsement of that movie. By the time you're hearing this episode, I imagine it's available on streaming or somewhere more accessible. It was Past Lives, and her name is Celine Song, and it was really interesting to think about how you learn to do what you do in film from a show like this. She got the gig because she wrote a pilot, and the pilot was about professional poker players. And the showrunner said, you wrote a pilot about poker that would be completely effective to people who understand nothing about poker. Come do that about a giant fantasy world. And she took the challenge and seems to be a
That's super
driving force
awesome.
beside some of that. So, all right, I promised Tyler like 4 days ago I was going to talk about film nerd stuff. So now I feel mission accomplished. I hope everybody has enjoyed these episodes about the television show. Let us know how you're feeling about the show, especially if you're some of those listeners who've talked to us about the books along the way. We'd love to hear what you're thinking about the differences. We will be back, as we said at the top of the episode, we'll be back next Friday. Our goal here is that you can have this episode waiting in your podcast feed. Use your Friday night, use your Saturday to watch a couple episodes, and then have us ready to talk about them when you catch up. Tyler, give the addendum to that about when the Amazon show drops.
Yes. So it is worth noting we are airing these episodes on Fridays. That gives you the weekend to watch and listen and do all of the things that you're interested in doing. It's wonderful. But be careful about getting in the rhythm of always watching things on Friday, because the television show is listed as debuting on Friday, September 1st. That is accurate. However, Amazon always lists their release date based on the date and time midnight Greenwich Mean Time. So what that means is that if you are like us on the East Coast or you're on the West Coast of the United States, the show will actually air the earliest you can see it on Thursday, Thursday, August 31st. At about 7 p.m. on the East Coast, whatever that is on the West Coast. You can do your own time conversions. So just be aware, we're airing on Fridays. It's because we're awesome. The show also airs on Fridays, sort of. So just keep your time zones in mind as you are keeping an eye on this. Honestly, the next couple of episodes that we are going to watch, even better than the first two. I'm super excited to see what Greg has to say about them. And we are going to have guests throughout the rest of our television show episodes. So get ready to hear some new voices, even if you are a longtime listener. Greg, I will let you do the last of our take us out of the episode. Any last thoughts you have as we go into the next couple episodes of the Amazon's The Wheel of Time?
This show had everything stacked against it for me because I am in an anti-Amazon household, and yet I was still won over by these two. I will continue to not support Prime, but let me use your password, please. Thanks.
Fair.
See you next time through the glass columns. So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, or Amazon. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, you can email us at throughtheglasscolumns@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Twitter by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to the show, leave us a review wherever you're listening, and recommend this show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time through the Glass Columns.